The prophecy of Isaiah. This is presentation 34. The suffering servant. Let's just reflect back for a moment or two. We have the people group of Israel, now known as the nation of Israel. God had brought them into existence. He'd protected them. He'd given them instructions for quality lifestyles. And he'd given them a strategic land. But it was for a purpose. It was so that they could live a quality of life that reflected the nature of God and share their understanding of God with the people groups around about. All that was left was Judah. And they failed. And Isaiah saw God's answer to this human failure of his people. And it lay in the picture of the suffering servant king. And throughout all his speaking, he pictured something of this suffering servant king in previous chapters. Now he develops it much further. Isaiah saw that the people of God, the people of Judah, they were in no fit state to do what God wanted them to do. They'd lost it. Their leadership had failed. And he foresaw the coming of a servant king, a new kind of leadership. But this servant king would fulfill the task on behalf of the nation, restore God's people, equip them, but also reach out into the world. And it was a radically new way of seeing leadership. His approach would reflect the very nature of God himself. And this would mean that humanity could be released by this coming servant king, because he was prepared to serve by suffering and to win victory by being defeated. Strange paradoxes. Now in this section, Isaiah describes what the servant king would do and why he would do it. So let's move into this section. It runs from the end of chapter 52 to the end of chapter 53, and it divides very precisely and very neatly into 5 stanzas of poetry. And we'll deal with all 5 separately before bringing it together. What God says about the coming servant, and is a picture of a contrast. There are contrasts all over the place. The next 3 stretches, an ordinary human being, but despised and rejected. How people saw him, they saw him superficiality, but what was he in reality? And then what happened to him? Humiliation and death. Isaiah is explaining what was going to happen and what it would mean. And then in the last stretch, he comes back to what God says about the servant. The servant fulfilled God's purposes, and the suffering of the servant king would break the power of human rebellion and enable humans to be released and set free if they so chose. That's the overall structure. Now we're going to look at each section in turn and see where it goes. But let's be in no doubt. This entire poem, 5 stanzas, relates to Jesus. And any attempt to interpret it into any other way contradicts the evidence. It's quoted in the New Testament in 7 places. 3 in the Gospels, 1 in Acts, 2 in Paul's writing, and 1 in Peter's writing. And all of them show that this refers to Jesus. And particular verses or ideas are picked up, but these are direct quotations from this section that Isaiah spoke so long ago. Jesus completely fulfills the picture. And as we explain it and unfold this, we can see how he does fulfill it in his life, death and resurrection in the most amazing and remarkable way. Isaiah understood the ways of God and the way that God would work. Of course, he could never have seen the actual person of Jesus. But Jesus fulfilled this picture in minute detail. Let's look at the first section, the first stanza of the poem, centered on what God says about the servant. And there's a contrast. A servant who is going to be humiliated. And yet by the humiliation he was going to be exalted. A contrast and a paradox. Isaiah speaks, "See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted." Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told they will see, and what they have not heard they will understand. Very strong statement. See, my servant. God is presenting his servant. Open your eyes. Look, here's the evidence. He will act wisely, translates the Hebrew, but what it means is he will accomplish his purpose. And perhaps that's a wonderful description of what living wisely means all about. We fulfill God's purposes for us in our lives. Now we often slip over this. The words are familiar. Raised and lifted up and highly exalted. That description in the Old Testament is only used of God himself, and indeed any attempt to use it of an ordinary human being is condemned. It's arrogance. This servant king is described in a way that could only be used to describe God. And those who heard this originally, for Isaiah spoke it, would have got that message. This servant king would be God himself entering our humanity. That is mind-blowing. Paradox and contrast again. God allows this servant, a human being filled with all the nature and power of God himself, God entering our humanity, limited by choice within a human body. God allowed the servant to be utterly humiliated. Now we don't like that in life. We hate being humiliated and put down. It's worth stopping and thinking that through. God allowed Jesus to be utterly humiliated. Now I've translated this as sprinkle because that's what the version says. But in fact, in many of the early versions in the original language, there's an alternative translation, the word startle. Now, probably the evidence for sprinkle is slightly higher, but the evidence for startle is very strong because it makes sense of the passage, and the next few lines fit together. So let's look at them. This humiliation startled many nations. Rulers were rocked back. They saw something they'd never seen in their lives before. And they began to understand that there's something strange going on. You see, success comes through suffering and failure. That certainly is startling. We don't expect that. We have got a description of success in our cultures throughout the world into which this does not fit. Success is so often seen in terms of achievement, being elevated by others, respected by others, given authority, given power. The picture Isaiah has got here is the very reverse. No wonder it's startling. And the people who ran things, these were the powerful people. They had the ground cut from under their feet. All that they thought was precious. This wonderful servant king, the great leader, he was doing it in a way that was completely opposite to the ways of culture. The entire concept of being humiliated and seeing that as the way of victory and success, that's utterly foreign, totally revolutionary. Isaiah would have hit these people hard. This cut right against all the current thought forms of his day, and it still does. And yet, Isaiah is saying they'll see it. It'll be public knowledge. It'll happen in front of their eyes. And of course it was all fulfilled in the utter humiliation of Jesus, in his parody of a trial. He's being whipped almost to death, body ripped apart, and then tortured to death publicly, stripped naked in front of the crowds. Now that's humiliation. And yet it was victory and success. Let's look at the next stanza. It pictures him as totally human, but rejected by his fellow human beings. Again, there's this contrast. Here is perfect humanity, and yet despised and rejected by other human beings. Isaiah speaks who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed. He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. The last section revealed God's victory being shown through utter humiliation. You see, this planned action of God is almost beyond human comprehension. Who would have invented this or thought it up? This is not the ways that we think of things in society, nor indeed the way that we think about things in religion or politics, where power, influence, and status matter. Here, humiliation matters. So it contradicts everything we could ever have expected. It must have made Isaiah very uncomfortable to bring this revelation. Didn't fit the culture of his day, doesn't fit the culture of today. And there's just contrast. The beautiful picture, and yet rejected. The perfect human being, despised by others. He came from a people group who had lost their way spiritually. Dry ground. And yet he was a normal human being. Nothing that made him stood out. Now the words there, despised and rejected by mankind, this is not so much a conscious rejection, but it's just a dismissal. Unworthy of attention, a nobody, irrelevant. And how much that pictures what happened in the days of Jesus. Just a wandering teacher who made a mistake, written off by the Jewish leadership, by the Roman authorities. But it's just the same today. In our culture, reflected in our media, Jesus is just dismissed as a kind of religious opinion that's got no long-term significance or importance. Now the words have got quite precise meanings here. Suffering focuses on spiritual weaknesses. Pain focuses on physical weaknesses. We've tended to too often spiritualize away much of what Isaiah was saying, and indeed much of the New Testament, forgetting the great healing miracles of Jesus. Jesus came to deal with the whole humanity. Spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, we are complete beings. And he went through physical and spiritual weakness. You see, that's our picture, isn't it? Even within church groups, we look for leaders who are going to be attractive, with personal magnetism, characters, leaders, standing out, dominating, giving inspiration. That's our picture. That's God's picture. We've got to rethink leadership within the people of God today. We've got it wrong. See, that's what we expect. And that's kind of implicitly woven its way through our culture. We think of God as almighty and all-powerful. That's true. And we see God trampling through evil and wiping out all opposition. We're almost afraid of God. Now that picture is growing in the West thanks to Islam. Because in the Quran, that's the picture of God that's given there absolutely clearly. God is almighty and all-powerful, and he will trample through the evil and he will wipe out all opposition. Sadly, there are some extremist Muslims who think they can become part of it, and they want to help God to wipe out all opposition as they see it. That's where it comes from. A wrong picture of God. But we all hold that in some measure. This was Isaiah's insight. Now just let that run through your mind. God coming as a suffering servant, winning victory by allowing himself to be destroyed. He was executed by torture, humiliated. That is utterly mind-blowing. And the people of God in the West, we've got to come to terms with that, because we've made our leadership wrong. We've encouraged the wrong kind of leadership, and we've valued the wrong way of doing things. And Isaiah comes across us with these radical insights. If that's the God we serve, we have got to rethink our lives in the light of that. It's worth stopping and thinking, perhaps even stopping this DVD and just allowing that frame to sit on the screen for a few moments, sharing it as a group or praying it through as an individual. We've got things wrong, and in the West we've got it particularly wrong. Other parts of the world are ahead of us. And amongst the people of God, we've got to see God in the way he is, not the way we've invented him to be. Let's move on to the next stanza. Again the contrast. Willingly he suffered because we all rebelled. Surely he took up our pain, bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray, each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He allowed himself to be afflicted. Yet again a contrast. There's the he and there's the we. He lifted off us our spiritual failures. He shouldered our physical weaknesses. Remember, he came to transform and heal us totally. And again, the words carry the ideas of the physical and the spiritual. They are linked together. They cannot be separated. Now we've got to watch here the meaning of these words. They are difficult to get across in the English. Punished, stricken, afflicted. Literally punished. It's not punished in the normal use of the word punish we have today, where we might punish a child. It's more of God touching him. The stricken side focuses on the physical experience, and the afflicted is often used of being struck by an illness. Now let me put this into a possible way of understanding that sequence of thought. There's a fundamental spiritual impact, and it comes through the physical pain he experienced and the destruction of his body. There's a sequence of ideas there, very deep, difficult to capture in the English language. Now the word pierced is used of being fatally pierced. He was killed. Crushed carries the idea of being trampled to death. And you can think and see how this fits the picture of Jesus in his trial, his flogging, and his execution. He was just trampled through as trash by both the Romans and the Jewish authorities. But he did that because of our rebellion and our flawed nature. God came into our humanity himself to deal with the problems we have got and give us the prospect of release. So again, this contrast between what he did and why he did it. It's us. And again, we've got to watch that word punishment. Words change in languages, and this is not the normal word in the Hebrew language for punishment. It's much closer to instruction, experience perhaps. The grim experience that brought us peace was on him. And what he went through can release us to peace and deal with our flawed human nature. If you think about it, sheep wander, easily led astray. We mess up in life. But all the consequences of our human rebellion, somehow they met on Jesus. And through his utter humiliation, the door was opened for the restoration of humanity. The next stanza, again the contrast. He went through total injustice, and his trial certainly was that. But he didn't retaliate. He had all the power of God, for he was God. He chose not to use it. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. He didn't sin. Total injustice. But he didn't resist. He didn't retaliate. Oh, how often when injustices are done to us, we retaliate. Now in the original, it implies that he allowed himself to be afflicted. There was no protest, no retaliation. By carries the meaning of because of. Because of all the oppression and judgment, all the wrong and injustice, he ended up being arrested, condemned. Now that sentence there is quite difficult. I put it in literalistically. From transgression of my people, contagion to him. Very compact words. Again, watch the word punished. There is no concept in this passage of God punishing Jesus. We've imposed that with Western thought forms through misunderstandings of translations. From transgression of my people, contagion to him. There's a kind of transfer. He did it in our place. Arising from all the things we chose to do wrong, it was like a disease falling on him. And he was humiliated and tortured to death. If you like, the blow fell on the servant, not on rebellious humanity, and we deserved it. And somehow in his death and burial, both the wicked and the rich would be involved. And we know from the story of Jesus how precisely that happened. Finally, to the fifth of the 5 stanzas. Again the contrast. It all looked like failure, and indeed the disciples in the days of Jesus thought it was failure, and they were scared stiff. But it was total success. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though there isn't actually the Lord in the original, and though someone makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. God's comment on all that has happened, or will happen. The servant king, through his humiliation and sacrifice, fulfilled God's purposes. And what appeared to be failure was glorious success. This is all part of God's perfect plan. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an accident. And those who suggest that simply do not know what the Bible teaches, or what the events of history show. Possibly the meaning of that is that we have got to accept his life as a sin offering. And the word sin there refers to intentional sin, not just making mistakes. There's a human responsibility to accept what has happened. But the servant king would experience joy and fulfillment. And the joy and fulfillment would be in watching human beings choosing to be released by what he did through his humiliation. And that speaks of eternity. The word knowledge there is probably closer to experience. By his experience, my righteous servant, the one who never did anything wrong, will justify many. Not everybody, because humans have to choose to accept it. And this is a revolutionary idea, that we can be made acceptable to God by what this righteous servant king will achieve through his humiliation. He sank to the lowest. It all just fell apart. but it was God's plan. And at the lowest, it was the highest. There's a deep message there for us today. If you look at Philippians Chapter 2, you'll find the picture picked up by Paul. All of us want to preserve our life, and we fight hard to stay alive. Jesus had the power not to go through the cross. He could have wiped out all his enemies. But he didn't. He resisted the natural instinct to stay alive and allowed himself, he poured out his life. He died with the rebels, 2 criminals with him, the day of execution, and he died for the rebels, you and me. And the word intercession there isn't really carrying the idea of prayer. It's more of a bridge, a go-between. Jesus is God's bridge to reach rebellious humanity, an idea picked up extensively in the letter written that we know as the book of Hebrews today. Now we've looked through the 5 stanzas. The problem is that we're familiar with these words. We've heard them read to us many times. The danger is they lose their impact. When Isaiah spoke this, the impact would have been absolutely enormous on Isaiah himself, but in his hearers. Sadly, his hearers didn't get it. We've got to think radically. We've got to recapture the impact. We've got to rethink the whole concept of leadership and leadership in God's people today. And it comes out of the way God works. We've got to rethink suffering and how suffering relates to success. We saw that's the way we see leadership today. And too often we have created leaders in our churches with these characteristics. That's not God's way. That's servant leadership, where the leadership are there to release the led, and the leaders are not the center of events. They are not the kingpins. They do not have power. Servant leadership is what we need to recapture in the church in the West today. We've allowed that picture to infiltrate and corrupt our church lives. It's wrong. We've got to recapture how God does it, because it gives us the model of how we do it. That's the right way. And we've got to accept that this is utterly radical. And too often we want power, influence, even resources and money, status, and we value those who are highly educated, who stand up, who are great orators with personal magnetism, with personality. That is not the way of Jesus, and it's not the way God wants us to run our churches today. Let's remember that. That's the greatest leader of all time. And he did it willingly. He never tried to retaliate or score points or prove that he was right. And God allowed it to happen. And that's the message that we've begun to lose today. Jesus robbed evil, the power of darkness, Satan, the evil in the world. He robbed it of its power to control us. And he did it through willingly suffering. We've got to rethink our expression of his way today. That's the way of success. That's God's way. And it has to be our way today. We've got to rethink it. We've got to rethink the whole question of servant leadership. And it applies to all of us. We serve others. And that may mean utter humiliation. And we do not retaliate. That's an Islamic idea, retaliation, taught repeatedly in the Quran. That is not the way of Jesus. Oh, what a deep set of ideas here. That's what Jesus was prepared to do, willingly, without retaliation. And Isaiah was beginning to get it, that defeats the power of our human rebellion. We want to run our lives our way. We think we know it's best, and we mess up. And that generates the human evil, where we hurt each other, each jockeying for power, status, position, trying to run our lives to our advantage. And this stems from the work of the evil one behind the scenes. God defeated that by coming himself in a human being and being prepared willingly to go through that utter, total humiliation. And he broke the power of our rebellion. He broke the power and consequences of our evil. And at a deeper level, he broke the power of Satan to control humanity. That's the way of victory. That's the way of success. And that's what the people of God, the people of Judah, needed to grasp. And in our communities today, we've got to re-grasp this and capture again God's ways of living in the world victoriously by being willing to suffer total humiliation. That's the message of Isaiah. And it's a message for us today. Next presentation, we move forward from this to look at God's invitation to us in the light of what he has done.